When the anxious partner finally walks away from the avoidant, the entire game changes. Because for so long, the anxious one has been the steady heartbeat of the connection, the one reaching, repairing, pulling threads together, refusing to let it unravel. And the avoidant, whether consciously or not, has relied on that. They've depended on the anxious partner's persistence, even as they resented it. They've built their illusion of freedom on the safety net of someone who would never leave. But what happens when the net disappears? What happens when the anxious partner, exhausted from running in circles, finally lets go? It feels unthinkable at first, doesn't it? Because the anxious partner has been conditioned to believe that their worth is tied to proving themselves indispensable, to chasing crumbs, to trying harder. They imagine that if they walk away, everything will collapse. Not only the relationship, but their very sense of being wanted. That fear is what keeps them locked in place, even when their spirit is begging for release. But here's the paradox. When they do finally walk, they don't collapse. They rise, and the one who collapses, often silently, often secretly, is the avoidant. It's not an instant crumbling you can see. It's subtle. Avoidants don't chase in the obvious ways. They don't flood your phone with apologies or grand declarations. No, their unraveling is slower, quieter, hidden behind walls. But inside, the dynamic that gave them power has just been disrupted. The certainty that you would always be there is gone. And when certainty disappears, the fantasy of control disappears too. If you've ever been the anxious one, you know that moment when you finally say, "I'm done." Not in anger, not in a storm of words, but in a quiet decision that clicks deep in your bones. It's not a performance. It's not a threat. It's the kind of decision that shifts the very energy in the air. And that shift is felt, even by the one who pretended they never needed you. They feel it, though they may never say it out loud. Because for the first time, the anxious has stopped orbiting the avoidant, and suddenly the avoidant is floating in their own emptiness. And here is where everything begins to change. The first change that happens when the anxious finally walks away is this. The avoidant loses the silent leverage they've always held. Think about it. For months, maybe years, the avoidant's greatest weapon has been distance, pulling away, withholding, creating silence, and watching how you respond to it. And the anxious partner, desperate to keep the bond alive, always responded the same way, by moving closer, reaching harder, proving more. That dynamic handed the avoidant a false sense of control. They didn't have to engage fully because they knew you would carry the weight of both sides of the connection. But when you stop carrying it, when you step back, not in manipulation but in true release, their entire strategy collapses. Suddenly, silence doesn't pull you closer, distance doesn't trigger your pursuit, their disappearing act no longer guarantees your return. And here's the part they don't expect. Without your predictable chase, their own avoidance is exposed for what it really is. Not power, not mystery, but emptiness. Imagine it like a stage play, where one actor keeps delivering dramatic pauses, expecting the other to fill in the silence with frantic lines. The moment you stop responding, the spotlight shifts. The audience sees the avoidant standing alone, mute, with nothing left to play off of. That's when their script stops working. That's when their power begins to dissolve. And this shift isn't just about them, it's about you too. Because when you no longer respond to distance with pursuit, you reclaim something you didn't even realize had been stolen, your dignity. You stop performing for scraps. You stop confusing their withholding with worth. You start to feel the difference between genuine connection and emotional starvation, and once you taste that clarity, you can't unknow it. The avoidant may try to reassert their control subtly. They might send a breadcrumb, a vague message, a casual check-in to test the waters. But now, something in you is different. You don't swallow it whole. You don't let a half effort reopen the wound. You see it for what it is, a test, not a gift. And with that recognition, the cycle breaks. The truth is, when the anxious walks, the avoidant's entire dynamic is disrupted. And disruption is something they've spent their whole life avoiding. But that's only the first shift. Because once the game of silence and pursuit is broken, another, deeper reality begins to surface. The second shift comes when the absence finally starts to sink in. At first, the avoidant convinces themselves they're fine. They lean on the same old narratives. I needed space anyway. This is better. I'm not built for closeness. They were too much. It sounds convincing, even to them. But absence has a way of carving out echoes they can't silence. Because here's the truth, even avoidants bond. They may fear dependence, but they're not immune to it. And when you, the anxious one, finally withdraw your energy, the constant stream of reassurance, the steady heartbeat of presence, that void isn't just quiet, it's deafening. Suddenly, they're left with the reality they've worked so hard to outrun. They miss what they pushed away, and the irony, they miss it most when it's no longer available. It doesn't show up as a clean admission. Avoidants rarely sit themselves down and say, I've lost someone who mattered. Instead, it seeps in around the edges. A song reminds them of you. A routine feels strangely hollow. The phone, once buzzing with your check-ins, now sits still, and that silence, which used to feel like freedom, starts to feel like loss. And here's the part that twists them. They realize they don't know how to get you back without surrendering the very walls that have always protected them. This is the collision they never prepare for, the collision between their craving for safety and their craving for connection. When you were there, they could lean on your pursuit to soothe their loneliness without ever admitting their need. But when you're gone, they can't escape it anymore. They feel the hunger they pretended they didn't have. They feel the cost of their defenses. And for many avoidants, that's the moment they begin to question not you, but themselves. And let's be honest, that's not always a moment they handle with grace. Sometimes it looks like them pulling at you in subtle ways, trying to reignite the dance without offering more. Sometimes it looks like them retreating even deeper into their shell, doubling down because facing their need feels unbearable. But either way, the shift has happened. The absence is alive, undeniable, and it changes the balance forever. And if you're listening to this and it resonates, if you felt that silence turn from torment into power, then hear me when I say this. You're not alone in seeing it so clearly. If this is landing for you, subscribe. We're just getting started. Because the third shift is even more powerful. It's the moment when the anxious one doesn't just walk away from the avoidant, they walk toward themselves, and that changes everything. The third shift is the most radical of all because it's not about the avoidant at all, it's about you. It's about what happens when the anxious partner finally turns their gaze inward instead of outward. When the energy once spent on decoding silence or softening distance gets rerouted back into the self. And for the first time, you start to realize that all that intensity, all that passion, all that fire you poured into keeping someone else close, it was always your power, it was never theirs. There's something profoundly disorienting about this stage. At first, it feels like free fall. You've been so used to measuring your worth in their responses, to scanning their moods like a lifeline. Without that, the world feels both terrifyingly empty and shockingly open. You look around and think, who am I if I'm not chasing? Who am I if I'm not proving? And that question, though it stings, is the crack where the light gets in. Because here's what starts to unfold. You remember yourself. The self that laughed without checking who was watching. The self that dreamed without shrinking those dreams down to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. The self that didn't apologize for wanting closeness, depth, passion, consistency. That self begins to surface again. And it's not the needy, desperate caricature the avoidant made you feel like. It's the self that always carried immense capacity for love, connection, and resilience. I've seen it happen countless times. The anxious who once thought they couldn't survive without the avoidant suddenly realizes they're thriving in ways they never imagined. They're sleeping better. They're reconnecting with friends they'd put aside. They're channeling their energy into creativity, career, or simply peace. And slowly, the nervous system that was constantly on high alert starts to calm. The body remembers what safety feels like, not because someone else finally gave it, but because you reclaimed it for yourself. And here's the paradox. The avoidant never expects when you shift your energy inward, you stop vibrating on the frequency of desperation. You're no longer a mirror for their fears. You're no longer orbiting their gravitational pull. And that's exactly when they start to feel your absence the most. Not because you're still chasing, but because you've stopped altogether. You're no longer available as the backdrop to their walls. That's why this shift is so powerful, because it's not just about leaving them behind, it's about returning home to yourself. And once that happens, the dynamic doesn't just change, the entire foundation it was built on begins to crumble. But the story doesn't end here. Because when you reclaim yourself, something even more unexpected unfolds. The avoidant, who once felt so certain in their distance, begins to feel something they've spent a lifetime running from. They feel regret. The fourth shift is one. The avoidant will rarely confess, but you can feel it if you look closely. Regret begins to stalk them. At first, it's subtle. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic wave of apology or a cinematic epiphany. It comes in flickers, in the quiet corners of their life where their walls can't protect them anymore. They'll remember the way you made space for them when no one else could. The way your presence softened the jagged edges of their solitude. They'll remember the way you noticed their silences, not as absence, but as communication in its own right. And now, stripped of that steady mirror, they're left facing something far less comforting themselves. Regret doesn't sound like poetry in their minds. It sounds like, what if I misjudged them? What if I lost someone who actually saw me? What if they never come back? And while avoidants pride themselves on being self-contained, those questions don't just vanish. They linger. They haunt. They expose the cracks in a system they've relied on their entire lives. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Regret in the avoidant rarely shows up as direct pursuit. It's too vulnerable, too raw. Instead, it leaks sideways. A random message at midnight. A casual, "Hey, just thinking of you." A sudden, inexplicable interest in things you used to love together. To the untrained eye, it looks casual. But beneath the surface, it's not casual at all. It's a probe. It's them testing whether the door is still open without having to admit they want back in. Now, if you're the anxious partner who has finally found your footing, this is the moment that can feel like the hardest test. Because everything in you remembers what it felt like to have them close, even for a moment. Part of you aches to believe that breadcrumb means change, that regret has transformed into readiness. But here's the truth you need to anchor into. Regret is not the same as growth. Missing you is not the same as choosing you. Longing is not the same as showing up. And when you can stand in that clarity, something extraordinary happens. You stop being hypnotized by their half efforts. You stop mistaking their nostalgia for commitment. You start recognizing that their regret is not your responsibility. And in that recognition, the power dynamic flips completely. This is why I always say, when the anxious walks away, everything changes, not just for the avoidant, but for the anxious themselves. Because by the time regret enters the picture, you're no longer begging to be seen. You're choosing whether to allow them a seat at your table. And that choice is no longer born out of desperation. It's born out of sovereignty. And if you know someone who has been stuck in this dynamic for far too long, someone who keeps mistaking breadcrumbs for bread, send this to them. Let them feel what it's like to hear the truth spoken out loud. Because the fifth shift takes us even deeper. It's the moment when the anxious realizes that walking away didn't just change the avoidant, it changed the way they will ever do love again. The fifth shift is where the deepest transformation happens, because it's no longer about the avoidant at all. It's about you stepping into an entirely new blueprint of love. For so long, your nervous system equated intensity with intimacy, anxiety with connection, unpredictability with passion. You thought the butterflies meant something was alive, when in truth, they were your body warning you of instability. But when you finally walk away, when you give yourself the space to breathe without someone else's push and pull, you begin to see love differently. Love no longer feels like chasing a closed door. It feels like someone opening one and welcoming you in without hesitation. Love no longer feels like decoding mixed signals. It feels like clarity. It feels like reciprocity. It feels like knowing where you stand without having to beg for reassurance. And the wildest part, once you taste this, once your body recognizes the difference between chaos and calm, you lose the appetite for anything less. This is where anxious partners often surprise themselves because the same qualities they once feared made them too much. Their craving for closeness, their hunger for depth, their longing for real connection are the very qualities that in the right hands make them extraordinary partners. What once felt like a liability transforms into their greatest strength. Their emotional availability, their courage to love fully, their resilience in the face of fear, those are superpowers in a world that's starved for intimacy. And here's what's so powerful. When you begin to hold yourself with that truth, you stop auditioning for love. You stop bending yourself into knots just to keep someone comfortable. You stop mistaking avoidance for strength. And because you no longer settle, your relationships naturally shift. You attract differently. You choose differently. You carry yourself as someone who knows they are not lucky to be chosen. They are discerning in who they allow close. Meanwhile, the avoidant often circles back, sensing the change in your energy. But this time, you're not waiting for their recognition to feel whole. You've already recognized yourself. Their return no longer dictates your worth. It merely tests your boundaries. And for the first time, you realize you have the power to decide, not from fear of abandonment, but from abundance of self. This is what changes everything. Because when the anxious learns to redefine love, they no longer repeat the cycle. They break it. And in breaking it, they build something stronger, not just with another person, but with themselves. But there's one final shift. Because once you've redefined love, you start to see the avoidant and the entire dynamic with eyes that are no longer clouded by longing. You see the truth without flinching, and that truth is liberating in a way you may never have imagined. The sixth shift is liberation, the point where the anxious finally sees the dynamic for what it has always been, without the haze of longing or the ache of unfinished business. It's that quiet, startling moment when you look back on the avoidant, not with hunger, not with grief, but with clarity. And clarity is freedom. Because when you've done the work to reclaim yourself, to redefine love, you can finally see the avoidant not as the great mystery they once seemed to be, but as a person caught in their own limitations. Their distance isn't power, it's fear. Their silence isn't depth, it's avoidance. Their walls aren't boundaries, they're barriers. And instead of interpreting those defenses as a reflection of your inadequacy, you finally see them as what they are, their burden, not yours. This is where the anxious transforms completely. For so long, you believed their inability to meet you was proof that you were too much. But standing here on the other side, you see it was never about being too much. It was about them being unable to hold enough. And that shift rewrites everything. Because now you no longer shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's fear. You expand fully and you let love meet you where you are instead of chasing it where it hides. And here's the part that often stuns the avoidant by the time they're ready to circle back, to test the waters, to reach out with those breadcrumbs of regret. You're no longer waiting by the door. You're living, you're thriving, you're whole in a way you never thought possible. And in that wholeness, their absence no longer defines you, and their presence no longer tempts you to abandon yourself. This is the ultimate reversal. The anxious, once trapped in fear of abandonment, realizes they are unabandonable because they've stopped abandoning themselves. And the avoidant, who once believed they could hold all the power through distance, is left facing the truth. Distance only works if someone is still reaching. When you stopped reaching, their control dissolved. So when the anxious walks away, everything changes. Not just the dynamic, not just the avoidant, but the entire trajectory of how you live and love from that moment forward. You step into a love story that begins with you and radiates outward in ways that finally feel like nourishment, not starvation. And I'll leave you with this question. What if walking away wasn't the ending you feared, but the beginning you've been waiting for? If this message has spoken to you, if you feel seen in these words, subscribe not as a transaction, but as a commitment to yourself. Because this isn't just about them. This is about you building the kind of love that feels like home. And that journey starts now.